Welcome back to Old School Sports and the final episode of our Out of the Park Baseball 25 mini-series with the New York Yankees. We're only going to end up playing 3 seasons here with the Yankees. I am a huge Yankees fan, and I'd love to continue play with them because I enjoy playing with them more than any other team. That being said, it's Tuesday evening as I'm working on this episode, and an updated patch for OOTP 25 is supposed to come out tomorrow. So hopefully by tomorrow evening when I'm back home from work, the patch will be out there and available. And although many of the updates to the game come through an existing game like this one, my understanding is that some of the changes in the first patch that's been out for, I think, over a week at this point, and the second patch that should be out tomorrow, there are some enhancements and changes and revisions that are made that don't really take effect until you start over a new game. So I'm going to do a new mini-series starting within the next couple of days. I'm not sure exactly what team it's going to be yet. But given that my main focus in OOTP is a long play that will be starting in April, kind of want to feel the game out in the second patched version that will be out tomorrow, and also play with a team that's a little more challenging than the Yankees to hopefully get myself ready for a really good challenge in the long play that will be starting in a few weeks. And if there's any of you who haven't seen the video that we put out back in late February, 10 challenging teams to consider in OOTP 25. One of those 10 teams will be the team that I'm playing in our long play series that'll be starting in the next couple of weeks. But before we finish off this series with the Yankees, kind of want to recap how the team performed this year, and with a lot of decisions going on in the offseason, what my approach would be to hopefully let this team move up to a next level. We were back in the playoffs this year, a 90-win team, hit 91-71, and we made it all the way to Game 6 of the World Series before we ultimately lost to the mighty Atlanta Braves. So it was a pretty successful season on the field for the Yankees. You can see we were 4th in the AL in runs scored, and we were 5th in the AL in runs against. So an above-average team across the board. Taking a look at our pitching, Blake Snell was our ace, even though he was not great in the playoffs. Still have him signed for several more years. He should be the frontline member of the Yankees staff for hopefully seasons to come with that 75 stuff. Griffin Canning is a free agent we signed this past year. Did a bit of a front-loaded contract with him, so at $9 million a year for the next 3 years, he should be reasonably good value for the Yankees. 11-7 with a 4.01 ERA. Another guy who wasn't great in the playoffs, but certainly will be back in the rotation next year. Carlos Rodon, still have him for another 2 years at $27 million a pop. He was 12-11 with a 5.19 ERA. Definitely expensive for the way he performed this year, but if he bounces back and he has a season like he did a year ago, I don't want to say he's great value, but for a team like the Yankees, he could still be a pretty useful starter. And then Lucas Giolito was only 8-9 with a 4.41 ERA in the first year of a potential 3-year contract with us, similar to Canning. We front-loaded it slightly since we had money to spend this past year. He was one of our better starters in the playoffs, so he'll be back in the rotation next season as well. So bringing back these 4 players, we're in pretty good shape with our rotation, and the one that we haven't talked about is the most expensive and arguably the most accomplished of the lot, although Snell does have 2 Cy Young awards to Garrett Cole's 1. But Cole was only 8-13 this year with a 4.72 ERA. You can see his stuff has dropped to a 45. Looking at his scouting report from the start of this sim just 3 years ago, he's lost a lot of stuff. He's lost a little bit of movement. He still has the good control, but he's also lost a lot off his fastball. He was throwing in the high 90s. Now he's struggling to reach 90 miles an hour. I don't think that that's magically going to change. Only 2 years left at $36 million a pop for Cole, and he's not willing to waive his no trade clause. So right now we're kind of stuck with him. I think I would certainly explore this offseason if there's times when he's willing to consider a trade somewhere else, trying to get him off the books. But my hunch is that we'd have to retain a huge part of his contract to do that. Given what we're paying him, he's probably back in the rotation next year if we can't get him off the books. Will Warren would be a guy who could compete to be a fifth starter if we do move on from somebody. Was not good in a brief foray with the Yankees this year, but at 27 years old, with 2 option years left, he probably is in the mix to be on the Yankees roster next year. Carlos Rodriguez, picked him up in the Rule 5 draft. He put up a 4.16 ERA over 71 1/3 innings, but is only going to be turning 25 in a few weeks. Still making the major league minimum. I think he certainly could be a right-hander out of the pen. And honestly, with a 5-pitch arsenal and 45 stamina, he could be in the mix to be a back of the rotation starter for us. Jesus Luzardo is a guy we picked up in a trade about 3 months into the season with the Giants. He was not great for us, a 5.88 ERA over 41 1/3 innings pitched. I like his profile. We could use another lefty. He's looking for around $11 million a year, though, and given that I don't think we have an obvious spot in the rotation for him, $11 million seems a little heavy in terms of the price to me for someone who we'd likely be envisioning as a reliever. Anthony Maldonado, another Rule 5 pick, 3.02 ERA over 62 2/3 innings. He is still going to be making the major league minimum next year, has an option year left, so we could put him in AAA if we needed. Kind of a generic right-handed bullpen arm, but if you got a guy who's doing decent for you, making the major league minimum, that's probably the kind of guy you want in that role. And then Jack Neely is a guy who really bounced back this year. He stunk as a rookie for us, but put up a 2.17 ERA over 70 2/3 innings. Kind of interestingly, though, his SIERA this year was actually higher than it was a year ago, so I don't know that all of his issues are fixed. He cut the number of home runs he allowed in half, despite pitching almost 30 more innings. So that certainly helped the basic statistics for him look better. But another guy who's making the major league minimum, so he'll likely be back in the bullpen next year as well. Andrew Nardi, setup guy, arbitration eligible. The number's going to be around $3.5 million next year. 3.28 ERA over 71 1/3 innings. Given that we're likely to move on from Luzardo, I think even at $3.5 million, with the way reliever salaries are in the game, and that's something that I hope will be patched and fixed going forward. Part of the reason why I want to try the new version starting tomorrow. But at this point, I think we would certainly keep Nardi. Phil Matan, 3.13 ERA over 54 2/3 innings. He is an important arm in our bullpen. We've got a team option for him for $4.5 million next year. And if I were going to continue this series, we would be executing that option. It's conceivable that Matan will be back as our closer next year. He's served that role for us at times over the last couple of seasons. He was not our closer this year for a couple of reasons. Our closer in the playoffs was Ryan Helsley, who was brutal after we picked him up in a trade with St. Louis right before the trade deadline. A 9.41 ERA over 22 innings pitched, 30 hits allowed, including 5 home runs in that very limited sample size will do that to you. He's headed to free agency though, and he's looking for almost $18 million a year over 3 years. Part of the reason why we would bring back Matan. And the other reason is that the guy who was our closer most of this year, David Bednar, had a great year for us. 2.87 ERA over 62 and 2/3 innings, 40 saves. But he too is headed to free agency, and he's also looking for a really big number, $18 million a year over 3 years. So, as I said, reliever costs and salaries seem to be inflated in OOTP 25 compared to 24. I think that's something that they're going to patch. Honestly, if I was to keep this team going, I think conceivably I might try to bring back Bednar or Helsley. I don't think I would bring them both back at likely 16-ish million a year. We can probably get them for, but I think they're two pretty solid, proven closers, and having one of them so we could continue to use the likes of Matan and Nardi as setup men would make this bullpen potentially pretty strong next year. So I don't think there's really a ton for us to do in the offseason to this pitching staff. If there's a superstar reliever that's out there and the price is reasonable, we'd certainly do that. And if there's a bargain starting pitcher, particularly if somebody like Cole or Rodon were actually willing to accept a trade, that would be something to think about. We'll see what the market looks like for Rodon. He was not great this year, but you look at his ratings and you would think he could still be a pretty effective pitcher. Shopping him around and saying that we're willing to retain 50% of his contract. Let's see what kind of market there would be. Now, there's a market for him. Now, granted, a lot of the people that you'd get back are highly priced veterans, or you can get back a player who's likely a little better than replacement level for him. But that would take a good chunk of money off the books. I might pop it down to just 20% and see what the market looks like at that level. And there's actually still demand there. So 27 million a year, you could get 22 almost off the books for the next couple seasons, and you could still get an interesting player in return or a cheap player in return. So if Cole was not willing to waive his no trade, which I don't think he will be, and there was a real interesting starter on the free agent market or available through trade, I'd consider dumping Rodon to open up a little bit extra money. I think that that's not an unrealistic path to pursue. Snell's the best guy on the team, pitching-wise, as far as the starters, and then Canning and Giolito are both a lot more reasonably priced. The two of them together are going to be making less than Rodon does this year. So if we wanted to make a change to the starting rotation, moving on from Cole and Rodon, to me, are the most reasonable ways to think about doing it. And with the no trade clause on Cole, Rodon is kind of the only lever that you could press right now. And before we go through all of our hitters, we'll talk about arguably our two most valuable infielders who both spent most or all of the playoffs on the injured list. Oswald Peraza, our starting shortstop throughout the season, missed the entire playoffs, hit .248 with 16 homers and 23 steals in 137 games. So a 91 WRC plus and solid defense primarily at shortstop added up to a 3.1 WAR for him. He's going to be arbitration eligible, making in the mid-twos. He'll certainly be back with the team next year. Anthony Volpe, injured in the ALCS. I believe it was the ALCS. Had a really nice season. .278 average, scored over 100 runs, 36 doubles, 24 homers, 30 steals, put up a 120 WRC plus and a career best 5.6 WAR. Great personality. Unfortunately, he's likely to miss all of spring training, so probably won't have him back full-time in the majors until May if we're lucky. Set to make $8.5–9 million next year in arbitration, but he will certainly be back in the starting lineup as well as soon as he is healthy. Turning to the healthy players, we thought we might have improved a catching position that's been mediocre at best for us in this playthrough by trading for Miguel Amaya about a year ago. And unfortunately, he had a brutal offensive season, hit just a $187 in 268 at-bats. Did have 7 home runs, so a little bit of pop, but still a WRC plus below 60 and not even a full win above replacement despite his solid defense. Still making the major league minimum next year, so he'll certainly be in the mix to make the team. Whether that's as a starter or a backup is TBD. Ali Sanchez, another guy making the major league minimum next year. He was our backup this year, but still got decent playing time because Amaya did have some injuries. He also was below the Mendoza line, hitting just a $197 and not really a lot of power. So he ended up with a 25 WRC plus, and he was well below replacement level. Another guy who we really like is defense at catcher, like his personality. He still does have an option year left, so he could conceivably end up in the minors. It's conceivable that we'd have those two back as our catching duo again next year, thinking that they can't possibly both be as bad defensively as they were this past season. But it's also a position where we're not spending much money, and if there was an option for a big-time catcher or even just a catcher that we were pretty confident was going to be league average with the bat with a good glove, that could certainly be an avenue for us to pursue in the offseason. Josh Bell is a guy who basically spent almost the entire year in AAA after he picked him up with a minor league contract. Hit less than 100 with us in 42 at-bats. He did make the postseason roster because of the injuries, but at 34 years old, bringing nothing to the table defensively, certainly won't be back next year. Austin Wells was our starting first baseman much of the year. Had a career best 27 homers and 78 ribbies. The batting average, though, was .237, and he struck out 135 times, so still a barely above average offensive player, only about a win above replacement level. Not great defensively. The big thing he's got going for him is that he's still cheap at this point, making the major league minimum, so he should be in the mix to be a first base / DH / corner outfielder / utility player, since he can catch and play third base in a pinch. Tommy Edman had a nice year for us. We signed him to a minor league contract with a $3 million option if he made the major league team, and he hit .250 in 324 at-bats, 87 WRC plus, pretty diverse talent defensively, some good personality traits. I'm imagining he's looking for relatively big money. Yeah, almost $10 million a year for 5 years. So he probably will not be back with us next year. Oswaldo Cabrera spent most of the year in AAA because he did still have options this year. Next year will be a more difficult decision. He produced decently with 21 homers in Scranton, although he was still a below-average offensive player. Only a 14 WRC plus and 45 major league at-bats. But if we do end up moving on from the likes of Bell and Edman, it's conceivable that Cabrera could be a utility infielder for us next year. Gleyber Torres at third base, pretty disappointing year. .227 average, 19 homers, 64 ribbies as our everyday third baseman, 83 WRC plus and only a 1.3 WAR. He's making pretty good money, 15, 16, and then a player option for 17 over the next 3 years. I look at his profile, and I think he's likely to bounce back. So I don't think that's an area where we need to make a dramatic change. But certainly would hope that we get more offensively out of Glaber next year than we did this past season. Caden Wallace had a nice year for us in Scranton after we picked him up in a trade from St. Louis. He was part of the trade for Helsley, and he hit over 300 with 7 homers and 10 doubles and 152 AAA at-bats for us. Another guy who's pretty talented in terms of being able to play a fair number of defensive positions adequately, also has a solid bat. I think, you look at Wallace, and he's a guy making the major league minimum, still has an option year left. Would certainly expect that Wallace or Cabrera is on the major league team, and I think Wallace probably has a little bit of an advantage with his better bat. Makes it even easier for us to potentially move on from Tommy Edman and to also move on from Tim Anderson, another guy who was a minor league free agent, spent most of the year in Scranton, but when we had some injuries came up at the end of the year, and he ended up being our starting shortstop for much of our postseason run. That said, I'm guessing he's going to be looking for decent money this offseason as well. Actually, he's not looking for a crazy amount. Less than $2 million in a year. So question how productive he's going to be with that well below average gap power and eye at this point. But at that price, given the glove he has and given the fact that we're probably going to be missing Volpe for the first month of the season, Anderson actually kind of in the mix to return next year. Michael Conforto, we signed him a couple years ago, traded him away to Arizona, traded back for him before the trade deadline this year. He hit 264, 5 homers, 23 ribbies, and 144 at-bats, put up a 115 WRC plus, and he ended up in our starting lineup in the playoffs against right-handed pitching. Team option for $13 million for next year. We would recommend, and we are going to void that last contract year, so he'll be headed to free agency. If the price for him was much more reasonable, I'd consider a reunion. And it looks like he's only looking for $3.6 million a year over 2 years. So at that kind of number, makes me feel real good about declining that $13 million option. And potentially there could be a reunion with him next year. Christopher Familia hit 242 with 7 homers and 240 at-bats as a mostly backup outfielder for us, but he did get some playing time as a left-handed hitter against righties in the starting lineup when we had some injuries. About a league average offensive player, less than a win above replacement level. He still has 1 option year left, making the major league minimum, so probably still a part of the organization. Everson Pereira had a really disappointing year after a great rookie season, or more accurately, a great rookie half season. Hit just 208. Did have 21 home runs, but still only an 85 WRC plus. He struck out in well over a third of his at-bats, barely above replacement level. Still could be in the mix to be a backup outfielder next year for us because he's one of the few guys we have who can play center field, but I don't know that he's necessarily as big a part of our future as we might have hoped he would be a year ago. Dalton Varsho did a really nice job for us as a center fielder this year when he was healthy. The issue is he wasn't healthy all that much, only healthy about half the year, but hit 262 with 20 homers and 48 ribbies in 286 at-bats, 842 OPS, 125 WRC plus, and a WAR of almost 3, thanks to his excellent center field defense, in addition to his more than competent offense. We're a little light on lefty bats, so I think we'd be inclined to try to bring him back. looking for $14 million a year for 2 years. We can probably get him for in the $12 million area. I think that's a guy I certainly would look to bring back next year. Oscar Gonzalez hit .333 and 90 at-bats at the major league level. He is a guy who is now out of option years, probably not a big part of the Yankees' future, despite the good hitting that he did in a very small sample size this year. And then the two big guns who did their best Mantle and Maris or Ruth and Gehrig impression this year. Aaron Judge, we put him through that development lab, strength and conditioning training last offseason, and despite a relatively low probability of success, he did have a successful program. Still fragile in terms of his injury proneness, but less fragile than he used to be. And you can see he went from an awful season where he played just 57 games and hit .215 a year ago to a monster year this year, 144 games, .271 average, 100 runs scored, led the league for the second time in 3 years with 56 homers and 135 ribbies. Also led the league in slugging percentage and WRC+. Making a lot of money, $40 million a year for another 5 years at this point, but he's not willing to waive his no-trade clause. He probably would have some semblance of value after this year, but since he's not willing to waive the no-trade clause, not really going to find out anything if we try to shop him. And think that you kind of have to just build around him, or we've already built around him. I think you just have to keep him in the lineup. We played him primarily as DH this past year. Of his 144 games played, you can see he played 59, 60 in the outfield. So he was in the field less than half the time. Think, trying to DH him as much as possible is probably the right way to go to try to keep him healthy. And then Juan Soto hit .292, 40 homers, 110 ribbies, led the league in walks once again, also led the league in on-base percentage and OPS, 162 WRC+, and a 5.9 WAR when it all was all said and done. He's opted out of his contract that we signed him to a few years ago, and certainly need to look to bring him back. He's looking for more money, $38 million a year over 9 years. It's an extremely long contract, but he's only 28 years old, and he is an extremely productive player. So looking at this team, with the fact we declined that option on Conforto, you can see we've got almost $80 million to spend. So even though potentially trying to bring back Soto and Varsho probably costs us in the neighborhood of $50 million a year, we would be able to bring back both of those guys and still have around $30 million to spend. If there was a catcher out there, that would be a logical way to go with a good chunk of that money. And then possibly bringing back a Helsley or a Bednar as our closer, or hitting the free agent market for a closer would be the way to spend a good chunk of the rest of the money that we'd have left. And as I said, if there was an ability to trade away Rodon and perhaps pick up a big-time starting pitcher that's a little bit younger and a little better, hopefully, that would be an option as well. Those would probably be the most obvious avenues that I would use to try to keep this team where it is and potentially improve this team. And as I noted, Conforto, Tim Anderson are guys that I would consider bringing back also on relatively low-priced contracts. Taking a look at the arbitration-eligible players, it's not really a huge list. Cabrera, I guess, is the only one that's a decision. I may have missed that he was arbitration eligible now, so at almost $2 million, or likely a little over $2 million next year, I think that his roster spot could be in jeopardy. I almost feel like if we're going to go with Wells, Torres, and then hope that Peraza and Volpe are back as our starting shortstop and second baseman, probably bring back Caden Wallace as a utility infielder, and then if we decide to sign Tim Anderson, given his nice glove, could mean that Cabrera is the odd man out, which would save us a little bit more money. Nardi, Peraza, and Volpe should all be back. And then, as I mentioned, maybe you make a run at Bednar, definitely make a run at Soto and Varsho. Think it's unlikely we bring Edman back with the money he's looking to make. And then Helsley is probably in Conforto, the only of the pending free agents that we'd potentially pursue. So I think there's an opportunity to definitely bring back the key talent that could be leaving this team. Number one is obviously Juan Soto, and then the second most important is Varsho. I think it's very realistic to bring those guys back. And then I said between a bullpen arm or two, possibly a starting catcher, and then a fourth or fifth outfielder and maybe a utility infielder. I think you spend most of your money that way. And if you can find a trade for Rodon and there's an interesting pitcher that's going to be on the free agent market, maybe there's a way to make that work as well. Taking a look at potential starting pitchers. Guy who pitched well against us in the World Series, well, in one game, not in the first game, but in game number 5 when the Braves broke a 2-2 tie to take a 3-2 lead. Fried pitched very well, but he's going to be looking for crazy money, mid-30s. Don't know that there's an obvious guy out there that I'd go after for. I think maybe the hope is that Rodon is better next year than he was this season, and you largely keep the starting rotation intact and hope that some of those guys who had down years but whose ratings still look pretty good according to our scout bounce back. And that's our review of the past season, and at a high level how I would approach the upcoming offseason if I were going to continue playing. But as I mentioned, this is it for this mini-series with the Yankees. We'll be starting another one with another team in the next few days, and then hopefully after 10 days to 2 to 3 weeks of a mini-series with that second team, we'll feel that OOTP 25 is updated and stable enough for us to begin our long play. And hope that most of you who are listening or watching right now, actually hope that all of you who are listening and watching right now will join us in the upcoming mini-series, and then especially in our long play that will be starting sometime in the month of April. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.